like 20 people.
Hello, everybody. Calling to order the short-term rental task force meeting for August 17th, 2023. Would the clerk call the roll? Here.
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 Here. Here. Great. And Kevin let us know that he wasn't able to make it tonight. We'll have an approval of agenda, but would like to add an item. We have Allison Furman here from Representative Andrews' office to speak for a few moments. So with approval of the task force, I'd like to add her after public comments. So she would become the new number 5. Can I? New number 4, sorry. So before the public comments. Thank you, Jamie. She just told me that a few minutes ago. So can I have a motion to yes. May I have, will someone make that motion?
We do it all in water. Make a motion to add the guest speaker Allison and approve the agenda for today's meeting, August 17th.
Is there a second? Great. Kathy. All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right. We can have one motion to approve both the minutes for August 3rd and July 25th. So if someone can make a motion including both of those dates. Pardon?
First, this is so minor, but I'd like to read. On the August 3rd, we had Holly is missing, because she wasn't here. Did you say that she opened and closed the meeting? I actually stepped in place, so.
So can someone make a motion to approve those meetings with the correction to the August 3rd meeting?
Motion to approve the minutes for the August 3rd, 2023 regular meeting, July 25th, 2023 town hall meeting with the correction for the chair.
Second. All in favor?
Yes.
Any opposed? All right. That takes us to our guest speaker. Allison, would you like to come and speak to the task force?
Hello, thank you for having me here today.
You move the mic down a bit. Great,
There we
thanks.
go. I'm from Representative Joey Andrews' office, and we've been working on some short-term rental legislation. So I just wanted to provide a quick update of what we've been working on. So the bill that we're working on, it would create a registry and database statewide for short-term rentals. That way, if anyone suspects that there's a short-term rental next to them or something, and they can go to their local unit of government, they can then check it against this database to see whether or not this is a registered unit. In addition to that, we are working on some different tax mechanisms in this bill as well. So we have an opt-in excise tax of 6% that municipalities can opt into. Of that, I believe we're trying to set aside 1% to go towards the department, which would oversee the registry, and the rest would go to municipalities. And then we are also working on automatically expending the bed tax. So that would mean like 2% of that tax revenue would go towards municipalities to use for like seasonally appropriate projects. So we're thinking projects related to tourism, and also working on something to where perhaps the visitors bureaus could use some of those funds towards housing, since short-term rentals are causing the price of housing to rise. And then there's going to be penalties in place for local units of government to revoke these permits if there's like violations of fire and safety standards, noise complaints, anything like that. We are trying to make it so that the short-term rentals have to follow the same fire and safety standards as traditional lodging. So that would mean carbon monoxide detectors, smoke detectors, and fire extinguishers in every room. And then lastly, we're working on amending the Zoning Enabling Act to make it so that short-term rentals can be restricted to commercial areas instead of residential areas. So it's kind of an overview of the stuff that we're working on in this bill. I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
So are you suggesting an additional 8% tax
Um,
on top of our CVB tax, on top of our sales tax?
yeah, so the 6% tax is opt-in. It's not something that has to be done. It's something that municipalities can opt into doing. We would be automatically expanding the bed tax.
And what's the tax?
I believe it would be the 2%.
Is that bed, BED,
BED, yeah.
like 2% per bed?
No, so the bed tax, it depends, I believe most of the time it's based off of like the room charge. I know that there are some carve outs for like counties, over by Detroit. But usually I believe it's based off of like the cost of like lodging. And then of that, the 2% would go to municipalities to put towards seasonally appropriate projects.
The full 2% would go to municipality,
Yes,
and of the 6%, if they opted, up to 6%, they opted for it, 1% to the state, the rest to the municipality.
yeah, so 5% to municipalities, 1% to the state.
Plus the 2% bed tax.
Yes.
It's a lot of taxes. We just priced ourselves out of the market.
So Representative Andrews is going to hold a town hall for Douglas, Saugatuck and township residents, I think targeting September 1st, the location, potentially Oxbow House, but TBD. So it'll be a listening session, so he'll be able to speak more about his proposals, which I think are still in the relatively early
Yes.
stages, and get input from residents. So that'd be a great opportunity for, I think, more dialogue there. But any questions again for Allison before we move on? Thank you, Allison. Really appreciate you making time to come. All right, that gets us to the first public comment period. Again, this public comment period is limited to agenda items only. So we'll have people come up. We'll start with people in the room, come up to the microphone, introduce yourself, provide your address, and then if you could also indicate which agenda item you wish to speak about, and then you'll have 3 minutes. So first person in the room who wants to speak.
Hi, my name is Peter Hansen. I live at 441 Spear Street, and it's agenda item 5A, which is the survey results. I'm sure that that's going to be a big topic of discussion today. While you were able to look at the IP addresses, we do not know who participated in the survey. By the way, each of our devices, smartphones, tablets, computers, all have a unique IP address. So for example, I could have responded from 3 of mine to the survey. During my time in business, whenever we surveyed a target audience. We made sure by various means we knew who we surveyed. Otherwise, the data becomes meaningless. In the case of this survey, all we know is that you have 621 completed surveys that you accepted. We have no idea who completed the surveys at all. An IP address doesn't show whether the person is a resident, vacation, homeowner, a business owner, or an owner of a short-term vacation rental. In fact, I'm sure we had completed surveys from people who have no interest in Saugatuck. They were just encouraged to participate by friends and colleagues. It was completely anonymous. So I'm a little disheartened to be at this point with a whole bunch of data, but it's data that I can't trust. And all I know is if I was sitting in your shoes, I would disregard it. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Next person.
Nancy Kimball, 550 Spear Street. And I want to speak in regard to agenda item 5D, which is the caps. And my comment really is also related to the survey. I, for one, found the survey question about caps to be very confusing. The first part of the question was, do you support caps of 20%? Personally, I would support any cap. So I answered strongly agree. Now, the next one is, do you support caps of 30%? I supported 20%. So I don't really support 30 because I support 20, but what do? I asked my husband, he said, I found it confusing too, but I answered yes to all of them. Now, so I did too, but I don't know that everybody did that. Way I read the responses, I think some people who said yes to 20 said strongly disagree to 30 or more. So I don't know how you can draw any conclusions from the data just because I found it to be confusing, notwithstanding Peter's comments. We're not even sure who answered the survey. So I really thought that that was important for you to think about before you rely on that particular question, because it was so confusing. And when I looked at the summary results, it seemed to emphasize that it was one of the least supported policies was the caps. But on the other hand, we had, if you looked at the full-time residents, who I think is what really counts, on page 23, it says 85% or 85 respondents strongly agree with caps and only 44 disagree. So how do you say that that's a least supported policy? I can't make any heads or tails out of the whole thing. The other thing I would like you to think about, there was no question about full-time residents and what is the value they add. And I can tell you, we add a lot of value. We serve on the government entities, we're on the boards and the city council. We support the nonprofits, we support the schools, we support the clubs. At what is the tipping point where we have so few people here that we don't have anybody to support these things? Do you think we would have the SCA if we had 60% short-term rentals and we didn't have people who care about the community? There has to be a cap. There has to be a limit.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Okay, we'll go to Zoom. If you'll raise your Zoom hand. Dick Waskin.
Yes, first, I'd just like to ask if everybody would be mindful of their microphones. I found at the last meeting, about half of the meeting, we couldn't hear what was being said. So if you can kind of ramp it up a little bit so we can hear everybody, appreciate it. I'm going to take a little issue with what was just said. And I'm Dick Waskin, 6576 Heron Ridge Road, Saugatuck, on 5D sub A. Concerning caps, I think that not only just through the survey, but also through the meeting, the town hall meeting that was held where residents and other people who had a vested interest in the community showed up, that it was quite clear there was no consensus at all about caps in the community. It was a pretty divided issue and there was no clear way forward. And I think that needs to be taken into account, that if you're going to do something as serious as a cap, which is going to affect actually the economy of the area, a cap is going to affect the value of housing, a cap is going to affect your tax base. It's a pretty serious and drastic measure to take to change zoning to adopt caps. And I think with not a clear consensus in the community, it would be actually irresponsible to go ahead and try to encourage and adopt caps at this point in time. What is clear is that when it comes to noise ordinances, when it comes to parking, when it comes to those other things that people are finding the issues that upset them, there you have a clear path forward to be adopting your good neighbor policy, to be adopting something that would include enforcement. Those are the things that I think you can clearly recommend to the Planning Commission as you move forward. But caps, you're nowhere near a place where you could make that decision. And as far as contributions to the community, yes, I firmly believe the residents are very, very important to this community. But second homeowners are also very important to this community. Business owners are also very important to this community. Our tourists that come and visit us are also very important to this community. They do contribute to things like the SCA. They do contribute to things like the Wishbone. They do contribute to the White Party and West Shore Aware, who raised $1 million. And these are people who are tourists who are actually giving money to us to help support our quality of life here. So I continue to take offense at the residents who say that they're the most important. They are important, but every part of our community is important. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on Zoom? Yes, Doug?
Hi, I just wanted to respond to that last
You,
response.
start with your name and
At
address.
Doug Rodwald, 413 Hoffman Street, right up here on the hill. I'll just start with my normal commentary. We're all for short-term rentals. We just, and this is regarding the discussion on caps. We, as homeowners that used to have a short-term rental here, that have moved here full-time, appreciate what it does for a community, appreciate some of the points that Dick brought up around the investment and the benefit that we get from, other people being able to come to the community based on leveraging short-term rentals. That said, there's a lot of FUD being put out there regarding, home prices, regarding everything, and that's all short-term rental driven. It's just not true. I think with interest rates rising, with everything else happening in the community, we have to take that in a broader perspective and truly think about quality of life. And a cap is a good way to actually set some boundaries. Should be 20%, should be 30%, should be 50%, who knows? But at some point, we have to lean into hard decisions, and we have to understand that there should be some economic drivers here outside of just home values that we take into account. What I found really interesting is I actually looked at the budget for 2022, 2023 for Saugatuck, because there's a lot of misinformation out there as well about how non-homestead people, contribute more to the tax bases of Saugatuck. They don't. So depending on if you're non-homestead or homestead, there's a different percent of the millage that goes to Saugatuck. So what does that mean? It means that we basically pay all the same amount to Saugatuck. Non-homestead does pay more in taxes, but based on what is in the budget, there's more that goes elsewhere and not to the town. So what does that mean? That means these short-term rentals, outside of the minimal fee they pay for however many years it's paid, aren't contributing for all the services that we have to put on top of it to manage them. So I think when we think about the cap, I would think about it as how much do we want these short-term rentals to impact us while we figure out all these other rules, while we figure out these fees, while we figure out the taxes. There's a lot of things that do need to be figured out. And the question is, how can we create boundaries in the short term? No pun intended there. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else on Zoom? All right, anyone else in the room? Yes.
My name is Janie Goodwin. I live at 165 Elizabeth Street. And I appreciate everyone's time and everyone's comments. I do want to bring up that it doesn't feel very inclusive. And it's one of the reasons that I am in Saugatuck to say that people that aren't here full time don't matter. So when you do include all the data, which I strongly agree with Dick Waskin and his data, I'm here probably 11 months out of the year. And I'm here because this town is a beautiful place and it's tolerant. So any decisions that we make, we should be inclusive in those decisions and keep that in mind rather than saying only people that live here full time. I'm more active in the time that I'm here than some of my neighbors that are here full time. So please remember our economy in the larger picture and what Saugatuck stands for. And for me, that's tolerance to all of our neighbors.
Thank you. All right. I think that wraps up the first public comment period, which takes us to the review and discussion section. A, with survey results. Ryan, do you have anything any context before we turn it over to the mechanic team?
No, Madam Chair, I'll turn it right over to them if that's okay.
Great.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So within your packet, you have multiple tables, multiple graphs.
Can you move the mic a little? Great, thanks.
Sure. Yes. So within your packet, there are multiple graphs, multiple tables to help try to illustrate the story as well. Our team has broken it down to a little bit more in the memo itself. Overall, though, we did ask residents who responded if they're a full-time, part-time, or non-resident. Of the responses we received of the 626, 242 had indicated that they're a full-time or primary home resident. 39% or 240 responses indicated a part-time residency or second home. And then 21% of those who took it, or 132 responses, indicated they are non-resident. We did go through the SurveyMonkey data results, looked at IP addresses where we could clearly understand that there was a duplicate or multiple, as some have indicated in the past, of like 5 submissions. We did try to pull those out if they were clear duplicates. Of that, I believe we found 5 that were clear duplicates. So it indicates that you have a total of 621 responses from the survey that we felt were valid. So still a really significant turnout for the community. I know as a sidebar, Chris and I are just happy to get 50 or 100 responses on a survey. So the fact that the community received over 600 bodes well for us when we did our analysis on this. And then please stop me throughout the part 2 if there's any topics that the commission would like to talk about as well. From there, we did ask, where residents lived, if they lived on the hill, downtown, on the northeast side, Peninsula West, or again, if they were non-residents. Moved into requesting information as well on, for those who are non-residents, where they are from, Saugatuck Township, outside of Allegan County, resident of Douglas, or were resident outside of Saugatuck, Douglas, Saugatuck Township, but within Allegan County itself. Respondents also could provide indications on if they're a business or STR ownership, and that's broken down as well, with 90% of respondents saying they do not own a business in Saugatuck, 77% indicating that they do not own any short-term rental, and then from there. And then also the respondents' view on the number of short-term rentals in their neighborhood. 34% indicated there are too many, for a total of 184 responses. 31% felt it was about right. 27% would be okay if there were more. And then 7% were non-residents. I know on page 11 of your packet, there is that table here. What benefits do you believe short-term rentals bring to the city? Later in your packet, there is more of a breakdown of the actual respondent numbers as well. So we did try to increase that, so be a little bit more legible for you as well. And that is on, maybe down. You want to try that here? Might be 18.
Yeah, it starts on 18.
Thank you.
Larger graphs.
Yep, larger graphs start on page 18. So other benefits, we found that based on the respondents, it supports city tourism at 89%. 78% of the respondents indicated that the short-term rentals support businesses in Saugatuck. And then 61% of respondents indicated that short-term rentals increase the city's tax base. And then those are broken down further by full-time, part-time, and non-resident response rates. Concerns around short-term rentals, as the task force has discussed multiple times throughout this process, big key items that were takeaway from this were noise, parking, and then on 18, we have lack of enforcement. And that there too is broken down again by full-time, part-time, and non-residents. We then further get into the policies of our the survey as well, looking at implementing a good neighbor policy, caps, revise the fee schedule, suspend or revoke short-term rental certificates. And then that is broken down further on 13 and 14 of your packet. But besides continuing for me to read off of this, is there any questions, any particular topic the task force would like to go into? I'm happy to continue to provide an overview, but I don't want to go over the same thing you're able to look at yourself too. So is there a topic you would, as a task force, would like to discuss further?
Why don't you, if, unless there are questions, why don't you keep going? Are there questions now?
No.
Why don't you keep
All right.
going?
Okay. We did ask full-time and primary residents if they would support the following policies around short-term rentals, such as, I'm gonna get to it. Thank you. Implement a citywide good neighbor policy. 104 respondents indicated yes, strongly agree. We also asked implement a cap on short-term rentals. And then that did break down multiple sections on, should it be citywide? Should it be based on residential districts? Should there be a cap at 20% or 30%? And those numbers are there as well. I'll touch base, I think, on that further when we get into the cap discussion itself. But as an overview, revise a fee schedule for every 3 years. 99 respondents said strongly agreed on that, and then broken down further from there. Enforce a minimum rental period for short-term rentals. That had mixed feelings, but again, the majority strongly disagreed with that statement. Implement occupancy limits stricter than the current fire code department limits. 78 respondents indicated yes, with the next highest strongly disagreeing. So some, differencing of opinions in that. Increase the fee for and fine for confirmed violations. 116 respondents voted strongly agree, with the next highest category being agree on that. Only 15 indicated that no, they did not agree strongly with that. Suspend or revoke short-term rental certificates for properties with multiple violations. Overwhelmingly, that was agree or strongly agree. If permitted by state law, should the city collect a tax on short-term rentals? Strongly agree at 105 responses. And then work with neighboring communities to preserve and expand affordable housing. Strongly agree and agree were the two dominant factors on that. Part-time residents felt on those same type of questions that, for implementing citywide good neighbor policy, 62 said we're in favor. Implement caps were strongly disagreed upon across the entire board for part-time residents. And then the other key item on there, enforce a minimum rental period, that was strongly disagree as well. So our full-time residents were more in favor of policy changes. The part-time or non-full-time residents were less in favor of significant policy changes. And then non-residents on page 21, which might be a little easier to see than in your packet itself up there, were relatively, again, relative here, kind of spread between strongly agree and strongly disagree on these proposed policy changes or potential for policy changes and caps. And then as we get into any questions on that before we get into the next section, talking about caps themselves. Any questions on the survey data, survey analysis further?
I do, but I think we'll get into it in the caps. Some of the observations, I similar to what are some of the issues that were brought up. I have questions on the interpretation of the data, but let's keep going.
Sure. So the survey is broken down, obviously, among residents by neighborhood in the city, right? And there are some interesting observations, I think. This is page 23, by the way, that I'm referring to. We asked people, understands point well taken that maybe this could have been confusing in that we asked generally, should we issue caps? Then there were subcategories of that over the following questions. But anyway, it was interesting to us that response to the idea of a residential district cap it was very polarized, obviously. And if you look at that top graph, your you have a strong agreement from full-time residents and strong disagreement from part-time residents, even those that are part-time on the Hill, right? Because if you look at the two graphs below, you can see the high level of agreement from the full-time and the high level of disagreement from the part-time. It's also interesting to us to see the disagreement with a residential district cap from downtown residents who we would have thought would be more neutral on that. That's kind of interesting, and that may indicate that your downtown residents, right, I suppose downtown businesses feel some housing crunch or something and don't want to have everything pushed towards them. Kind of an interesting one. Overall, of course, there really is a clear divide between the full-time and part-time here, and you've seen that in public comment. It's coming out in the survey as well. Looking into some of the more specifics, there really isn't a ton of support on a commercial district cap in and of itself. Obviously, you see some strongly agree. Those are generally people who also just strongly agreed in all categories with caps. Capping at 20%. This is an interesting one in that as soon as you get into the one of our thoughts is that there are folks who are very strongly in favor of caps who think those percentages might be too high. Now, understanding that we are right around 25% now, looking at a cap below 20% has policy challenges, to say the least. What we did get from the survey that if the cap is at that level, that there seems to be some concern that that's too high from some people. Now, they're getting mixed in with the folks that are opposed to having any cap at all. And I think this does go to the public comment that was made and how folks answered that question. So I do want to acknowledge that because I think you can see that in these responses. I don't think we should be interpreting this as all 231 people who said they're opposed to a cap of 20% are all saying they want it either higher or lower. Because I think both higher and lower are being mixed.
Hey, excuse me, I'm sorry to cut in here, but on behalf of the people participating via Zoom, we lost substantially all of the audio just recently here, so we can't hear the presentation.
For flagging that.
Thank you.
No, it's still very faint. Yeah, it's really faint, and I think it's that way for other participants too.
Yes, it's that way for everybody.
Yeah, still quiet.
Was it quiet from the beginning of the meeting or did it get quieter?
Your mic is picking up well.
It was totally fine. Fine.
So,
Just
hit-
dropped in.
so Chris, why don't you move the mic closer to you so you're not speaking to it from an angle?
Is that better?
Fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, okay. Well,
So.
I
just-
am a little baffled by microphone technology because that was about a 3-inch move. But anyway,
I think it's so just to everybody, I think if you're speaking at an angle to the mic, it doesn't work. So, and since we're sharing mics, if when you're speaking, move the mic so that you're speaking directly into it.
I was actually going to kind of wrap up. So as an overall takeaway, I think you're hearing from full-time residents that they are strongly in favor of caps, but there isn't consensus on the specifics. I think we're seeing from part-time residents that they are strongly opposed to caps. And the non-resident group, some of whom are township residents, some are further afield, is really split on that issue. Now, there are some issues where we're seeing some agreement between the non-residents and the full-time residents, or these part-time and full-time residents. And those tend to be in the area of good neighbor policies, occupancy, any type of interventions in housing that are separate but related to short-term rentals to try to improve the availability of housing, and the types of sort of neighborhood getting along with each other, things like taking the trash bins back up, things of that nature, simple things. There does seem to be broad agreement in the survey on policies that would get at that type of landlord or tenant responsibility, and could be potentially enforced on a city level. As
Any-
Kyle said, we can take any further questions.
Yeah, any questions for Chris or Kyle?
Chris, I do have a question, or just see if you would agree with the way I was kind of looking at this. You said there's a big difference, equal number of people who are full-time residents that were somewhat in favor of caps versus those that are not in favor, the part-time who are not in favor of. But yet when I look at the results and see if I'm reading this correctly, on the full-time residents, we've got about a 60% that have said that they are in favor of caps, about 40% said they're not in favor of caps. So 60-40. So that's almost getting closer to 50-50.
Which graph are you looking at,
I'm
Steve?
looking at the graph on page 22, where it says citywide caps all response. And then if we look at the part-time, it's very clear, it's about 90% that have said no, and about 15% seem to be in favor of a citywide. So yes, it is a difference, but I wouldn't say it's substantial, because on the full-time, the way I'm reading it, it's about a 60-40. On the part-time, it's like 90-10. But if we look at it overall, it's more of a 60-40 for the no. So I just wanted, when we're saying that it's a very clear that the full-time are fully supportive, I think it's a 60-40 as opposed to being 90-10 on the part-time.
That's
unless I'm
fair.
misreading.
That's a fair analysis.
Okay.
That's a fair analysis.
And the numbers shift when we look apart from it's citywide cap, but when you go to residential zone, it seems like, and we don't have percentages here, so it's hard to tell, but that the gap between full-time residents and part-time residents around residential caps shifts. Is that correct? I mean, it is a bigger gap than it is for a citywide cap.
Yeah, I think that's a fair analysis as well.
So when you're asking people like living where they live, what do you think? You get different responses versus looking at the city as a whole.
Yes, which is why we broke it down that way. Yeah. Because your policies can break down that way if you want them to.
Right. Okay. Joe, did you have a question?
No, I was actually going to agree with you, and that's how I was reading as well. So if I'm hearing correctly, what we're hearing is from the residents' point of view, from the residents' point of view, there's a broad support of caps. But as you get down more granular, it's not at the city level. It seems to be starting to show more at the residential level. And that's where we're starting to see some disparity between the two, correct? That's how I
Yep,
interpret.
yeah, my
interpret
take was there's not really support for a citywide cap. I mean, a strong, consensus for a citywide cap, but there looks to be especially among full-time residents, support for caps within residential districts. And Chris, that is accurate based on your reading of the data?
That's fair. I do think Steve's point is well taken, though, that while there is support for for a residential cap among full-time residents, the numerical level of that support, I don't want to say the passion, but the numerical is closer to a 2/3 majority as opposed to the close to, more of a 75% majority of opposition from the part-time. Right. And it's up to the task force how much weight you put on that difference. Right.
Yes, because I was trying to bring it up, Chris.
Steve, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. I was just bringing it up for that point was just to try to, make certain we all kind of see that it's really like a 65-35. I'm not suggesting that one is right or one is wrong,
Right.
but that we just kind of clarify as we kind of take a look at it.
But I think to Holly's point, a citywide, if the reaction of full-time residents to a citywide cap was 71 strongly agree, 51 strongly disagree, which is not nail biter, but the 51 who strongly disagree should be taken into account, right? When it goes to a residential district cap, it's 85-44. So you flipped some people there when you went from citywide to residential. And that, just to be clear, that was full-time residents I'm talking.
Jacob, can you raise your hand if you're hearing better? Or wave at us. Okay. Okay, other questions for the McKenna team? All right. Sean.
I think, we just kind of beat up caps pretty good here, but I think when I looked through the survey, which the survey can, just kind of give us an idea, I still saw that it came down to the three key things that we talked about: occupancy, enforcement, parking. Those seem to be, whether it was full-time, whether it was part-time, whether it was city, those seem to be the key items that in general, we all agree need to have some help. So each category is definitely strong and powerful, but I do know that, if we were going to start with something today, those three items I would put at the top of the list to start with. I also think that whatever we start with, should probably be a suggestion or a trial period to just see if improvements can be made. I think to go in and make hard changes and say, this is how it's going to be the rest of our lives, is pretty drastic. I think, trial and error is good to work with. And I'd love to do a survey a year from whatever changes are made, just to see how the residents, full-time, part-time, feel about it, and kind of analyze it again and move a program better every year versus trying to fix everything at a snap of a finger. But I do believe that the city is divided on how they feel about it. So small steps feels better to me than one giant leap.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments before we move to the master land use plan? All right. Kyle and Chris, if you can.
So as we started this process some months ago, one of the key factors that was asked of us to do is also review the master plan to determine what goals and policies are in that tri-community master plan that align with or align against short-term rentals. A master plan is a policy guideline. It's a policy vision document for the community itself. Most master plans are 5 to 10-year visioning documents. Some go out as far as 20, but they set an idea of where that community would like to be in a given point, like 20 years down the line, 15 years down into the future. So while they may have nice goals, objectives, and policies, they're meant as guidelines and how to help kind of steer your direction of the community. They're not set action items on how you're going to regulate that. That's what your zoning ordinance does. So as we look through here, I wanted just to bring that back up, that the master plan is the policy document for the community. It's not the zoning ordinance and how you're going to regulate land. So as we went through the analysis of this, and this is just our findings of this, we looked at the overarching goal of what the master plan is, and that's, improve the quality of life for all citizens in the tri-communities through the implementation of policies and best practices that preserve the existing small town rural character of the area. And Steve, I might defer a little bit to you at times too, being and Holly on the planning commission for any additional background. But as we went through this, we looked at community character, what the goal is, such as retain and enhance the quiet, scenic, and small town rural character of the tri-communities. There's a policy listed in there that discusses preserve the character of the tri-communities area by encouraging land uses and densities of development that are consistent with maintaining its town and rural nature. And then we asked the question, do short-term rentals support this policy? So for this case, this policy and goal, we found yes, a single-family short-term rental may be more appropriate to maintain the small town character than a motel or hotel. The next goal we had under community character is, preserve the established character of neighborhoods and rural areas within the communities. And policies of that and how to get to it discussed, preserving the character of the area by encouraging land uses and intensities of development, which are consistent with and complement the character, economic base, and image of the area. Do short-term rentals support this policy? Maybe. Short-term rentals may support the character, economic base, and image of the areas as tourism-driven city, but may also be too dense, intensive a land use. Land use and community facilities, the goal there is to promote the balanced, efficient, and economical use of land in a manner which minimizes land use conflicts within and across municipal borders. Do short-term rentals support this? Maybe. Short-term rentals promote an economic use of land by permitting property owners to gather supplemental income from the rental rate. However, short-term rentals can be more of an intensive land use than a single-family residential use. And then further in here too, we looked at economic development. Do short-term rentals support this policy? Yes, by strengthening and expanding upon the area's economic base. Do they encourage the development of commercial land uses in appropriate locations? We said, yes, short-term rentals offer an additional lodging option close to downtown Saugatuck. Housing residential, we looked at this as well for encourage a variety of residential dwelling types. Do short-term rentals support this policy? Maybe. Allowing short-term rentals can help homeowners, especially part-time residents, pay for homeownership costs such as property taxes, but may increase housing prices as investors purchase housing for short-term rentals. There's other policies in here as well. So to recap what we did with this master plan, again, is to look at how do short-term rentals, aid the master plan, or how do they not aid your master plan as a goal? This came about too because as the master plan is your policy guideline for your community, and then there are actions or land uses within the community, does your master plan or your visioning document support that type of land use and that use overall? So that's what this analysis is further. So while some may or may not agree with our findings here, that is how we interpreted the goals and objectives of the master plan, and then to determine if the short-term rentals support that or not from a master planning standpoint, not from an economic development, but just from looking at your policies within the master plan. So that's why there might be items in here that we viewed as being supported or not supported that others may not agree with. So I'm happy to take further questions on that, or even defer to Chris for further expansion.
Questions, comments? Joe?
At the risk of sounding argumentative, yeah, and I don't know if we want to get to this level, but I'm not sure I agree with the first goal. And policies support, sorry, do short-term rentals support this policy? Yes, a single-family short-term rental may be more appropriate to maintain the small-town character than a motel or hotel. I think the distinction is a motel and a hotel would exist in a commercial district, whereas a short-term rental can exist in a residential neighborhood. And by far, I think that's, probably one of the primary concerns we're hearing, at least from some of the residents, right, and disruption in the residential community. So, I would argue that that would probably fall more into the maybe or to no category, or could be qualified by saying short-term rentals in commercial districts, because, I think this is going to be a big core discussion point of ours going forward now as we kind of look at what's a short-term rental, what's a commercial entity, and those types of things. So I just wanted to get that comment out there.
Yeah, I think that point's well taken. We've discussed repeatedly the potential negative impacts of a short-term rental on its immediate neighbors. It is, though, I think, worth considering what your downtown and other commercial areas would look like with 250 additional hotel rooms. What would that hotel have to look like, and would it be consistent? So I think the balancing those two items it's something you guys have been doing all summer, and that we have to do with these final recommendations as well.
Other comments, questions? I'll just say I've also had a pretty big challenge to that is the space where somebody would build a hotel is, would be out. I mean, first of all, the master plan is a tri-community master plan, so it's for Saugatuck Township and for Douglas. So using that as our guide, and when you read through it, I think many people would conclude that a hotel would be more probably along the Blue Star corridor in the township. So again, but we don't need to quibble. Okay, anything else before we move on? Lauren, did you have okay. Let's move on to objectives. Steve?
Before you do move on, I think I've said this in some other meetings, and it kind of relates to what Sean was talking about earlier. I just want to kind of remind everybody who's on the task force, who's not familiar with the whole master plan and the planning commission, is that the master plan that we're looking at here was developed back in 2016. They started working on it in 2014, passed in 2016. The desire of the planning commission, and I think of the entire tri-community, is to review this master plan and recreate it for the 2026, which means we'll start really looking at it a lot closer in 2024. So one of the things, like Sean was saying earlier, that we all might want to keep in mind is that we can discuss items that everyone agrees upon maybe now, knowing that as we're looking at the 2026 master plan, maybe a subset of that is also short-term rental. And at that point, we kind of evaluate what we are doing potentially here this summer. Is it working or not working, or do we need to go further? And then it can be evaluated again in 3 years. I just want to kind of put that out so that everyone's kind of aware that that will be coming up for the 2026 and starting work on it in 2024.
Great. And then another reminder that this is a recommending body, not a policy-making body. So the process is we'll make recommendations to the Planning Commission. The Planning Commission will review and, fine tune how they see fit. They will then recommend to City Council, and then City Council is actually the policy-making body. So important. I know we all know that, but reminding everybody in the audience. Okay. Objectives.
Madam Chair, I don't know, we don't have a particular document presented on this. It's been discussed during a number of your meetings. And so I think the thought behind putting this on the agenda was just kind of, again, framing things to know, where are we at, or what are our goals, what are our objectives that we're looking to accomplish as we kind of have this next discussion related to whether or not there should be a recommendation related to resident or caps in particular residential districts. And so just for the task force's knowledge, myself, Chair Anderson, and the team from McKenna met via Zoom with a short-term rental expert that's based out of New Orleans, but has a lot of experience with short-term rentals, and really really kind of framed it, similar to how, we've been having these discussions are, what are your goals? What are your objectives? What are you looking to accomplish? And then once those questions are kind of answered, then you can kind of get into, what your recommendations, are based on what you're finding out.
So McKenna, did you bring any written objectives for us to look at as we tee up the short-term rentals discussion?
No, these were still the objectives that we've already have discussed, as Ryan indicated in the past on that. So on this one, it would just be to probably validate those objectives that we've discussed in the past. So no, at this time, we don't have any written objectives to review.
Okay, we need to, and obviously it's not going to happen at this meeting, but as we get to as we make recommendations, we have to write those down. And I'm a little frustrated because I know I have asked several times that we actually look at them. We'd hope to have them at the town hall. So we really, you can't, if you don't know what you're solving for and look at them, it's hard to come up with solutions. And while it's great that we talk about them, it's hard to really align to something that's verbal and not written. So I would ask that as we go forward, that written objectives be part of what we see. I think what we've talked about is supporting a strong tourism economy, maintaining the small town rural character of our community, and addressing sort of the nuisance pain that, as Sean noted, I think there's great consensus for that. Again, we need to write these down and look at them, but I think before we go into a short-term rental discussion, making sure that we all think that those are the objectives, because what's going to happen likely is people will come up with great ideas, but we need to say, well, does that meet one of our objectives? Is that an objective? And that's going to be really important when we get to the planning commission and when we get what gets recommended to city council, because again, they have to know what we're solving for before we, recommend policy.
Understood. I apologize.
So as oral objectives, as we get into the CAP discussions, can we live with those, or Sean? I mean, I just want to be sure we're kind of on the same page, because if we're not on the same page, we need to get on the same page.
Well, I don't know if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, but I'll tell you what I'm thinking. I believe part of our objective that we've learned throughout the task force here is we need to have enforcement of current or future ordinances, rules, whatever we come up with. That seems to be a major objective for me.
Yep.
I believe we need to have some sort of cap on the R1 zoning district. That seems to be where the most concern for full-time residents are.
So
that could be looked at several ways, whether it's an overall cap, whether it's an occupancy cap, whether it's from this day forward, do we go backwards of what's out there? I mean, that's kind of a loaded question, but it's something that should be talked about, in my opinion. I believe if we are talking about trash, there should be some sort of enforcement on how that is, and that could be an objective, could be tied into the occupancy. If your home has, an occupancy of 6, maybe you have to be required to have 2 trash cans. If you have an occupancy of 8, maybe it's 3 trash cans. I don't know, but that could be something that could be presented. I think when it comes to the parking, that could be tied somehow to the occupancy as well. I mean, if I remember right, currently to have an STR, you have to have an STR, you have to have 2 dedicated parking spots. But if, for instance, if you have an occupancy of 10 or 15, people, you really can't park in two spots. So I think that that has
So-
to be looked at as well.
I think I'm going to pause you for a second. These are great ideas. Some of them are solutions versus objectives. So the idea of a cap may well be a recommendation, but it needs to go to sort of what's our broader, why are we doing that? And so I think that would be, I mean, it's something around, preserve, keeping neighbors in the neighborhoods or preserving neighborhoods or does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think as an overall objective, we're trying to find harmony between, the interested parties, our residents, short-term rental property owners, whatever. We're trying to find a middle ground or some kind of common ground that allows us to coexist, right? That's ultimately what we're trying to accomplish, I think, here. And that would be my number one objective.
Yeah, and I guess I may have, overstepped where.
No,
where
I
that
think-
was, but again, I'm looking at the whole of through all the different line items, those seem to be the things that keep coming back.
Right.
So however I say it, those are the things that I think we have to
Right.
concern ourselves with as objectives.
Steve?
And Sean, I think what you're saying is you're kind of getting to the solution, but what you can look at it is that you were talking about, yes, if we had parking or noise or trash, those would all kind of relate to the nuisance part of the objective. So the objective is to address the nuisances. Those would be a solution to that, but they'd also be maintaining the objective of maintaining a small town feel. Because small town feel, you want to have a place to park, you want to have the ability not to see trash on the street, and you want to have it somewhat quiet. So your solutions, I think what Holly's looking for, do they relate to our objectives?
Correct.
Right.
And then are we in agreement that those are kind of our objectives? Is that correct, Holly?
Yeah. Anne?
I know that we've also talked quite a bit about the good neighbor policy. I don't know if that would be an objective or.
I think that would be sort of a solution under the,
Okay, gotcha.
yeah.
'Cause I know we don't even have one, so.
Right.
Okay.
right.
So Holly, I do agree that, we talk about issues and we all have great ideas for solutions, but we haven't came down to the core.
Right.
I
What are our objectives? Right.
think we got to think about all of that to come up with what the objectives are.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can kind of get there both ways. And I think we all, I mean, I think there's really clear consensus for, effectively addressing the nuisance items and maybe a separate one is better enforcement. I mean, either those are together or they're separate, but I think that's a no-brainer. I think the other, then what's the other? Is it, or the others? Is it maintaining the small town community feel? I mean, is that something we want to commit to as an objective? And, I think given how important tourism is to our economy, we either need to couple that with, in balance with tourism, or we need a separate support our tourism economy. Because clearly, I mean, if supporting a tourism economy wasn't important and just the neighborhoods, then we would, potentially eliminate short-term rentals altogether. And I think we all know that that would completely gut our town. So again, I know I'm kind of harping on this, but I just want us to get really clear on sort of the 3 or 4 overarching objectives and then all of the, the neighbor policy. I think, great meeting last week on some of the easy kind of the low hanging fruit. So I think we're making really good progress. I just want to be sure that each thing we recommend ties up to an objective that we agree on. So nuisances enforcement, are we comfortable with a small town community feel, retaining that and supporting a tourism economy?
Yes.
McKenna, did you capture those?
Yes.
And we'll see those in all of our future discussions, meetings, when we're talking about recommendations.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, then I think that takes us to the discussion on caps. Ryan, do you, we start with, I know you have been working with McKenna to develop a new data set for us. We had a resident voluntarily go through all of the databases and kind of provide a spreadsheet of kind of by address of where we are. Ryan then took that with other data that he had and with what McKenna had provided, and McKenna, with Ryan's support, has come up with what we think is a pretty close data set that Ryan, you can take us through.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. You're correct. Yeah, a fellow citizen of yours took a lot of their time to literally, in some particular circumstances, go one by one to try to gather some data. So, and he presented that data recently, which I thought was kind of interesting. And so, and then concurrently, we've been working to, kind of clean up the different data sources that we have. And so that work was recently completed. And so we were able to kind of compare what we were able to come up with the sources that we have available to us as staff with what this particular citizen came up with, and the kind of a one-by-one analysis, and it's pretty darn close. And so what's before you here is that, after a couple of meetings ago, we had some concerns about, total parcel numbers and what was being included. And what we kind of found is that we were dealing with some situations where maybe there were some parcels that were retired, but showing up in some parcel data that was being provided to us by the county and the assessor. And we also kind of got a better grasp on which property classes from the assessor were being included in the data. So some of the data was including essentially parcels that may have like common elements or personal property taxes related to them. So we kind of took all those classes out and kind of really broke it down to, because you wanted to look at residential districts. Okay, which parcels have a classification of residential improved, which means that there's some sort of like housing unit there, or as a residential condominium. We took out any residential vacant parcel. So it's a parcel that doesn't, isn't built out at this point as a housing unit. So we just kind of focused on those two particular classifications in your residential zoning districts. And you can see the kind of how that breaks down on the screen. And then it kind of was able to take a look at and map out with their software how many parcels have at least one short-term rental units on it, knowing that some parcels may have an accessory dwelling unit. So there may be a couple. We may have some properties where there's, two family dwellings, but at least looking at how many parcels at least have some short-term rental on them in those particular zoning districts compared to how many of them actually have are classified as a residential property. And then we kind of have the percentages there as far as what that looks like. So that's what's before you as kind of a cleaned up data source. It's pretty close, pretty darn close to what the fellow citizen came up with as well. So I feel confident that we're right in the ballpark. Depending on how you view it from a policy perspective, there's other ways to look at this. Others may feel like, it should be looked at in a different way, but I do think this is a fair way to look at it. And talking with the expert from New Orleans, he felt that the most common way to look at short-term rentals numbers was to take a look at how many housing units you in fact have. And so I think this gets us pretty close to that.
Great. And a big thank you to you, Ryan, for pushing this forward, and to the McKenna team for your work as well. So Chris and Kyle, do you want to tee up a discussion?
Can I
I'm
ask
sorry,
one
yep,
question regarding the
course.
data? And
Yep.
thank you very much, Ryan, for pulling it together. I think we're all happy to have at least a baseline now. And one question though is this inclusive of outstanding requests for short-term rental permits or exclusive? And if so, what's out there still?
I'd have to look at the exact date. I think we're working off of probably mid-July's.
July 5, I believe it was.
Okay, so it was early July or the last. We've had some come in since then. So yeah, you're correct. There may be a few that have come in since then. Now, not all of the requests that have come in since then are brand new. Some of them are like new ownership situations where
Sure.
new owners applying, so the number really wouldn't change.
Not a big number then.
Correct.
But, and as of early July, it was inclusive of the backlog at that time, these numbers.
Yeah, by that point, a number of them had already had inspections.
cleared
and-
out.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Thanks. Any other questions on the data actually before we move on? Great. So Chris and Kyle, do you want to tee up a discussion or just have us have at it?
Well, I just have one context comment. And that is that if you combine all of the R1 districts, because obviously you guys have a number of, your R1 district is somewhat complex in that it's broken down into several categories and they're all listed separately on here. Just wanted to give the context of if you add them all together, it's 143 short-term rentals out of 507 total housing units. So it's just one more number to add into the discussion. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I don't want to dive into this right now, but it's going to be relevant, is that when we met with a gentleman from Granicus, he did mention a few different ways to implement a cap. And I don't want to sidetrack us by talking about them now, but we do kind of have those ready to discuss when you get to that point. If you decide to move forward with any sort of cap.
Okay.
So I think what we're asking from the task force today is, I mean, this cap idea has come up for a while, and then you wanted to kind of test it with the community through, you know, your town hall and your survey. So I think we're at the point where, you know, we're asking the task force to have some discussion about whether or not you want some recommendations provided on a cap in certain residential zoning districts. And then kind of some maybe boundaries on, you know, what would be a deal breaker or not, if that's something that you would like to see a recommendation on.
Okay. Well, maybe we just kind of go around the table and people can provide general comment. Sean, I know you spoke a little bit, but maybe each of us can provide perspective on should we consider caps? And if we do, what would you recommend that we consider?
I don't mind starting.
Great.
If you want to go around the horn.
Sure.
I would love to hear what other communities have done as far as caps and what have been the consequences, what have been the positive, the negative when it has come to caps. And if that's something that you can discuss with us, that would be great. The idea of maybe our market is correcting itself. I understand that, you know, we've talked about this before, that the fact that there was a boom during the pandemic and things are starting to settle down a little bit. Or the flip side of that is it's gotten out of control and how do we get it back? So those are just some of those discussions that, you know, go into what we're thinking, but I do want to hear what some other communities have done and what have the consequences been because of caps that have, you know, been implemented.
Would you like us to answer that now, or do you want to?
Yeah, I think that's good.
So as a broad scope, what generally happens with a cap is it kind of depends on where you place the cap, and it's whether you place it above or below the current level. Caps that are placed above a level, certificates continue to be issued till that cap is reached. Any certificates come in after that violate the cap one way or another are just denied. Some communities will maintain waiting lists, and then they'll call the first person on the list once the certificate rolls off. That's a possibility. That option is less disruptive. But and I'm not saying this is the case, but if the feeling is that there are currently too many, it doesn't solve that problem. If we think that's a problem, right? It just stops further growth. There are some communities that got in, yes, early on this issue and thus were able to put in very low caps, at least in residential districts, City of Holland being a very prominent example of that, without creating issues. Now, there are options if you want to put in a cap that is below the current level. And these were discussed with the expert from Granicus as well. The most common is simply to say that you don't pull certificates. It's just when certificates expire, they are not allowed to renew until you get under the cap, right? So there are the first certificates to expire end up being kind of the victims of the new lower cap, right? So, and that's the most common way to do it. The problem, I think the problem with that is clear, and that is that there are basically arbitrary short-term rental owners that will be impacted and everyone else will be fine. But communities do it. It does successfully lower the number over time down to the cap. And at which point you just administer it the way the cap would be administered, right? As soon as one cycles off, that opens up a spot, someone else can fill that spot. There are other options. There are some communities who have implemented a cap that starts, say, January 1st. On December 31st, everyone's certificate expires. On January 1st, everyone who wants a short-term rental submits an application, and that goes into a lottery system or something like that. Some communities have implemented that as a citywide lottery, and we're just going to pick the first 150, 200, and they're in. And if your name didn't come out of the hat, tough luck. Others will do it more on a geographic basis. So we talked about one community, the Granicus talked about one community that did it on a block by block basis, and they made a rule. And again, not saying this is the policy you should pursue, but their rule was one short-term rental per block. And if you were the only person who entered the lottery on your block, congratulations, you win. You get the short-term rental. If there was more than one, then there was a name drawn out of a hat. The winner got the short-term rental. We were warned by Granicus that that can lead itself to bad faith applications because, oh, my neighbor wants a short-term rental. I don't want any short-term rentals. I'm going to issue, and if I get pulled out of the hat, I'm just going to hold the permit and not actually use it, right? This being an option. So again, just wanted to give you kind of the pros and cons of that option. The third potential way to implement this creates a lot of work for Ryan. And that is to create some sort of point system. So same thing where all the certificates expire, everyone has to reapply, and then you have some sort of point system whereby the top 150 or 200 or whatever your cap is, applications are the ones that get approved, and your point system could be based on geographic location, or the physical capability of the site to hold the short-term rental for things like parking or its backyard or something like that. It could also be based on ownership, a local owner taking priority over a non-local owner, other things of that nature. But the downside to that, of course, is that program has to be administered. And then you have to decide whether that's a program you continue, if that's a one-time thing just to get to the cap, or if that's something that always happens and someone has to get over some sort of threshold to be approved in the first place. Lots of complexity there. Am I too loud? Is that a thing? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Kyle.
Lauren, that what Chris just described is done a lot across the state for marijuana facilities as well, a point system. Applications come in, a review committee, it doesn't have to be a single staff person, but a review committee that will then tally up points and say, yes, these 5, have enough points, therefore they're recommended to get certificates through the council. If the others don't, here's why, sorry, you can reapply next year, see if you, meet more points. As Chris mentioned, though, that does put a high burden on staff to do that. Like Chris mentioned, the lottery idea, then that would be a permit renewal every year. So there too is a lot of staff consideration that the task force should review on that. So we're happy to talk about these further, and I didn't mean to cut Chris off in that regard, but I guess at that point, then we might want to ask the task force before we dive to Sean and others, what the feel is on those policies. That might help drive the comments further.
Great. And before we go on, I know our attorney is in the top box on Zoom. Anything giving you heartburn that you want to weigh in on before we continue our discussions?
Not too much heartburn. I think it just is a pragmatic matter. Having short-term rental licenses that are already issued and people have been relying on those to operate, sometimes for years, and they've expended money improving their properties with the expectation that they will continue to receive a short-term rental license. To me, voiding all of the short-term rental licenses and then issuing fewer than are currently held could have the potential to invite litigation from probably multiple short-term rental license holders. I will say, just kind of out of personal experience, the communities that I've worked with that have implemented a short-term rental license cap below the current number of short-term rental licenses that are issued in that community, don't make it retroactive. It doesn't affect existing licenses, so that essentially you're at whatever number you are when the cap is imposed, and gradually licenses ameliorate over time. And then when licenses are, terminated or expire or whatever reason, finally, and it comes below the cap, that's when you start issuing licenses again.
Thank you.
Just some food for thought.
Yep. Any questions for legal? All right. Okay, are people comfortable giving preliminary thoughts or questions?
Yes.
Steve? Okay. Sean?
I'd like to hear everyone else's thoughts and say mine last, please.
Oh.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have concluded an actual answer yet.
Okay.
What if we kind of have our consultants provide some breakdown of what other, I heard what you guys were saying, but it was a lot, like lotteries and caps and such. I do agree with the attorney as far as, the people that have had this property for 10 years and it's, for them, they continue to renew. Maybe having current ones being grandfathered in, and then no new licenses being released. I don't know. Again, I don't feel like I have enough handle on the understanding of the cap, but I think an objective is kind of more for us is, before we talk about recommendations for it, is to have an understanding. Like you said, as far as legally, I think that would be something that we need to be concerned about. I do think there needs to be a bigger handle that for these people that have violated multiple times, that there's a risk of losing those, that license, to help with a cap per se. Don't punish the people that are doing things the correct way and the right way, just because, their license is up for renewal. Now they can't get a new license. So that's just.
Chris, did you have something to say?
No, not really.
Okay.
I have
okay.
a thought, but I want to make sure we keep going around.
Okay. Steve?
Well, this probably, just based on some of my comments earlier, we're not surprised. I'm trying to come in, like everybody's on the task force, and listen to the entire community. And we've heard a lot of different things. We've already kind of clearly noted that there are some nuisances that we do believe we absolutely have to address and make recommendations to planning and to hopefully planning then to the city council. When it comes to talking about the caps, I kind of look at that and I listen to the people and I say that it was somewhat split between full-time residents, and that it was very clear that the part-times, which make up a significant part of the community, feel that it's not necessary. The idea that we may be able to make recommendations that will address a lot of these nuisance type of issues, and maybe with the other things we discussed, interest rates going up, with taxes going up, with this proposed bill in the state of Michigan, if we can put a 6% excise tax and a 2% bed tax, that may eliminate a lot of people making decisions that they want to operate a short-term rental, which is another reason why maybe a cap is not necessary. And again, trying to take baby steps into this, I kind of lean towards the side of not. If there's the majority of the task force that would feel that there is, then I would kind of go back, and I've talked to a lot of people in the community, and we said, what would be the number? And everybody's got different opinions, but we did kind of come up with that if 1 out of every 3 of your neighbors, so if 2 out of every 3 were residents and lived in their homes, and 1 out of every 3 was that tolerant? And the answer I got many times was yes, because they kind of felt that's where we were right now. And if you look at the survey, when they polled how many people are comfortable with the number we have or would be okay with having more, it was the majority. So the majority of people said that they were comfortable with where we are, and about another third said that they would be open to even allowing more. So given that, if we had to discuss it, I would think that if we would potentially look at maybe a 35%, a 33, like the 2/3, living in, 1/3 out. Plus, if we looked at it, if we were going to, if that was what we're going to recommend, a 35% would also keep us under the percentage that we are currently in the city. So therefore, you wouldn't have to worry about how do we handle, lotteries and everything else. So that's kind of where I stand. It's long-winded, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Thanks, Steve. Kathy?
And I agree with everything that you said. So I won't go into that. I think the cap issue is, been put out there to try to solve a problem and we don't know what the problem is. I think that people want the caps based on, they want different neighbors than short-term rentals. But that's never really gonna happen, even if you have a cap. The neighbors are gonna be the neighbors, and they may be short-term rentals, or they may be other people. We can patrol them, we can help control those that have short-term certificates, but changing the percentages of how many are here and how many are there, it's not gonna change who ends up buying the house next door and becoming your neighbor. You don't just get to pick that. And putting a cap in, I don't believe is gonna solve the problems that people have in the residential areas with not feeling like a neighborhood. I don't think it's gonna do that. But I guess we really need to see if we're gonna do caps, we need to see what objective we're trying to fulfill by putting caps on, because it's a lot of work, it's a lot of legal issues. We're gonna be in court. I'm sure someone's gonna sue us. And it's gonna take a lot of money and a lot of time to put a cap.
Joe?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of information that's come at us. When I hear the term caps, and I always keep going back to what are the problems we're trying to solve, which is really the objectives we're trying to meet. And, you know, I hear consistent complaints about the noise and the parking, the garbage and the loss of community feel in the neighborhoods. And I don't take that lightly. I don't think it's idle. I don't think these are idle concerns by any stretch of the imagination. And when I look at the numbers, it's clear to me that in certain areas, we're getting higher and higher density of short-term rentals to residents. And I suspect we're going to hear a lot of the concerns coming out of those areas, right? So when I look at caps, first of all, let me try and delineate a little bit. I think when we talk caps, and Sean mentioned it, and I'm glad he did, we should be considering caps at a dwelling level and at an occupancy level, right? And I think that, at least it's been my observation and a lot of the neighbors I've talked to, we get a lot of the noise complaints, which is obviously one of the number one concerns we're hearing, is coming out of, you know, dwellings that have very large numbers of occupants, right? And so I think, you know, when I look at that, I kind of look at it and I say, hey, somewhere along the line, there's a threshold where we're running a business in a residential area, right? And when you start getting into the realm of 12, 15, 20, whatever people cramming into a residence, I start saying, come on, there has to be a line somewhere. And I know it's a very tough thing to do as a task force when we make recommendations, but we have to look at that. We have to say, time out a second, right? This is kind of violating the principles of what a residential neighborhood is supposed to be. So I look at that and I say, I think when it comes to recommendations, we should be tapping the brakes on the number of people we're allowing in any one residence, right? I did take time and talk to Chief Janik. He is absolutely in support of that. He sees it as a safety issue, the fact that we're putting so many people into some of these residential dwellings. And he also agrees that it in essence is a violation of the premise of how residential neighborhoods were constructed in the original zoning ordinances that were set up. And I think if everybody takes a few minutes and goes back and reads it, you can see that, right? Promoting residential neighborhood feels, so on and so forth. So in terms of you know, so I think if we address it at the occupancy level, we're going to take away a lot of the noise issues that we're hearing. As far as the dwelling level, I think we're seeing that density in certain neighborhoods, and I, you know, to be so bold, I think we do need to tap the brakes there. I think, you know, in certain areas where, you know, where we have residents or different pockets of residents that are getting completely surrounded by short-term rentals and, you know, all the disruption that comes with it. And to be fair, I think I look at my neighborhood and 60, 70%, if not more, of the short-term rentals, people that come into those houses, they're well-run, well-managed, right? and there are no problems that come out of them. But the few that are there that aren't well run and aren't managed and are high occupancy are ruining it for everybody, right? So I look at that and I look at the number that are surrounding some of the people and I say, I think we need to tap the brakes a little bit. How we do it and what that level is, I think that's for us to decide if we come to the, consensus that we should be doing some type of caps at the dwelling level. And if we don't, then we're going to be split and saying we can't come to terms. But I think, I think 30% is even high in some of the neighborhoods. So, I look and there's 32 in R1. Some of these others are very low. Is there a way we can come to a level where if we do want, we can set the level where it's coming out of some neighborhoods where we cap that, right? Where we're not growing more and maybe push the load somewhere else to make it more, compatible with the residents, the local people, then I think that's something that we should be discussing and looking at. So that's my point of view.
Great. Anybody else? I'm hearing a couple different things and maybe McKenna, you can come back to us with some structure around it for us to make some, deliberations and recommendations. It sounds like we have a couple of options. I think there's general consent. I mean, everybody agrees we need to have recommendations on how to address the nuisance issues and enforcement. So I think that's a no-brainer. So we start with the objectives. We know that there are a set of recommendations around that. I think then, based on what I have heard, and I think it's worth us exploring whether we want to do some selective caps in the residential neighborhoods. I think there's no appetite for a citywide cap either in the data or on the task force, but it does seem like there is some interest in considering, and again, we're still at the consideration stage, whether we want some caps in the residential districts. And so I think to the legal point and others, we don't want to pull the rug out from underneath people, because that I think would be disruptive and litigious. But what are some smart ways if we decided we wanted to pursue that? We would recommend. I think we could get another free hour from the Granicus guy, and so maybe it's worth another conversation with him as your recommendations crystallize. And then we can bring it back and really that would be the focus of the next meeting. But I think we need something close to a written report because we're coming on. We've got 2 more meetings as well. We've got the next meeting and then we need to present to the Planning Commission on the 22nd. So I think we need a draft report at the next meeting with all of this that we can look at and hopefully come to recommendations. And I've just said that without asking our director of planning if he thought that was a good idea or if what you would add or subtract from that.
Madam Chair, I think you're spot on. I think we were aiming for that first meeting in September to have the initial draft for you to react to, and then additional changes could be made between that meeting and then your meeting on the 21st. I just want to make sure that the kind of team feels like they have what they need to, I guess, start formulating. I think we had very good discussion in the last meeting as well. I think we have a good grasp on kind of those recommendations to bring back. I just want to make sure they have what they need and have heard enough today on the cap discussion to formulate maybe some options to consider.
Madam Chair, if I might.
Yes.
So our task coming forward, and we highlighted a little bit of it last meeting as well. Chris and our team will come back on your September 7th meeting with more than just recommendations, but it'll be probably an entire draft report. What the process started with, why you're here, what the analysis has looked like, what Chris has done for like the retail market, what the parcels have looked like, some of the various maps we've talked about. And so it might be a bit of a hefty document for the task force, but I want to preface that to a lot of this we've already seen. It's just now putting it into one document itself. And then in that as well, we'll call out the low hanging fruit that we talked about last meeting that we probably almost heard since May as well, recommendations for that. And then maybe at a separate memo that we can insert later will be hey, here's the last few items we've talked about as well. Do you, the task force agree with these recommendations and these topics? And then we can insert that into the draft report and then present that on the 21st.
I do want to, as we move forward towards that, confirm where we're at on the framework for these recommendations. So we have the three objectives as articulated by Holly, and I think that our recommendation is the wrong word. Our draft to you next time should be organized around those objectives and then the policies that implement them, right? And it sounds to me, and I actually don't want to take them in the same order because I want to put the tourism one last. just
Yeah,
thinking
that
about
makes
this,
sense.
Right. So if the first objective is to maintain our residential neighborhoods, right? Then it's the cap discussion that implements that. So we'll come up with, based on this discussion, a residential cap that is higher than the current number and an implementation strategy for that. So that's that one. On the nuisance level, we seem to have broad consensus on the need for a good neighbor policy and a landlord and tenants' rights and responsibilities that would be written into ordinance and be enforceable. So we'll work on our recommendations for the specifics of that. And then finally, the objective on maintaining the tourism industry is actually, it seems to me that the recommended policy there is actually a lack of change. It's to only do the first two items to allow the short-term rental industry to continue with these additional controls on one, its overall growth, and two, the behavior of individual landlords and tenants and the physical and operational conditions that they will need to operate under. And I say all that just to kind of confirm, is that where we want to go?
Yeah, I'll go, I mean, I don't think that no change means the only way to support our tourism industry through short-term rentals is to leave things as they are apart from the nuisance stuff. I mean, I think, and again, Granicus seemed to confirm this. If the market didn't tamp it down or, hold it, if there's unfettered growth from here, that eventually that could erode tourism because we would lose one of the big draws that brings people here, which is our small town character. So I think those are inextricably linked, and I would not support that structure.
I think that point is well taken. I think under the tourism objective, it sounds like actually the residential cap can be described as something that protects the tourism industry by protecting the community. And the nuisance regulations protect the industry by protecting the industry from low quality so that you can be assured that a short-term rental in Saugatuck will be high quality based on, and we can articulate that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think we know short-term rentals are key to our tourism and we want them. But we don't want to get to the point where we start to, cook the golden goose or egg or whatever that cliche is. We don't want to do, we don't want too much of a good thing. It is a bad thing. So. Okay. Yes, Sean.
I'm ready now.
All right, go.
One concern I have is we seem to be pushing this cap persona that we have to have a cap. When he said that was part of, to meet of our objective was some sort of cap, I'm still in my head going back to we have issues without a solution, and I do not believe that a cap will solve the issues. So when I came on the task force, I wanted to be able to try to look at this as a whole. And then for some reason, it feels like some people or some part of the community feels that a cap is going to solve issues. But I'm still going back to the core. If there's no one to take care of an issue, whether you have a cap or whether the street is painted blue or whether the light's working on the corner or not, if it doesn't get fixed, it doesn't solve the issue. So I think what the residents would like to hear and property owners would like to hear is if we're gonna do something, whatever it might be, I don't want to get it narrowed down to this word cap. I think that seems to come up a lot. It's like the word change. When we started, everyone's saying change, 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 change. And I just think the solution is simple and it sounds complicated.
So I think what we're talking about here is giving us, looking at what the objectives are, what might we do? And I think we all know we want to do some things to address the noise, trash, all of that stuff. And I think, that we can come to agreement on that. I think the outstanding question is, do we want to, given all of the data we've seen, do we want to also consider caps? And we may well decide no. This is for our discussion, not.
I understand that, but if our objective is to solve noise and garbage and all that, why would we not consider enforcement instead of the word cap?
Because.
It seems to be narrowing right to this word cap. And
Right. Well, I think
that's what I'm hearing. So
yeah, I think part of that is we have heard, and again, whether it's some majority of people within the residential districts that they would like one, that that they think there are too many people in their neighborhoods. And so I don't know how we talk about that without talking about a cap.
But what if we try doing like a kind of a great enforcements first?
I think that's I would encourage McKenna to put that.
Focus on that for now.
One of the reasons-
until
one of
we
the-
absolutely need to, yeah.
one of the reasons I'm saying that is maybe I don't like all the loud boats that go down the river. And I come up to say, I want to have no more loud boats. I want to have a cap on how many boats go down the river.
Or no cigarette boats.
Again, it's not a solution.
Yep.
So maybe I'm simplifying too much, but I understand where it's got to be. But I think under that first one, with the objectives, we have to have more than caps. We have to have.
Absolutely. And if you can organize what you present us in a way that it's sort of from simple to more complicated. And I think we'll need to get you'll need to get the packet to the city in time so that we can get it to the and it's great because we've got an extra week before our next meeting to get it to the task force with, enough to like by Monday so that people really have time to absorb it and read it. But again, yeah, I think we might land anywhere. It's kind of a continuum of change from, I think, change we all agree on, enforcement of, the nuisance stuff to, it could potentially include caps, and then we'll discuss as a task force what we want to recommend.
Madam Chair, I also
Yes.
think it's important to maybe homework for us as a task force is to start writing down some of recommendations. So, because we are kind of on a time crunch, because I know, like, I have some ideas just being in the industry. I know you and, we all have had experience or things that, how we'd like to see these things roll out. So recommendations, just jot them down. Just so that we kind of have something, a working sheet of recommendations. So you guys just jot some things down that you think for those four objectives.
Okay. Sean?
And I don't, if I guess I'm a little bit concerned of why we're pushing so hard for September here to.
It was in the resolution that city council passed.
But I'm also, I guess I'm okay if we aren't comfortable with it to, slow the pace a little bit. And again, I believe that whatever we do, we should be monitoring this after the fact as well. And I mean, I'm okay staying on and, it's not my favorite thing to come here every 2 times a month, but I think it's important for the community too, that if we start something, whatever it is, we have to be able to monitor it and also give suggestions on whether or not it's working or not working, and be able to, let council know and let the citizens know that they can get some feedback as well as what might work. And maybe that would be one of our recommendations that, we feel that we can move forward with A, B, or C, but we'd like to add a D or an E that maybe wasn't thought about. Because I just think there's so many open discussions yet, and even if something does get recommended or changed, there's gonna be a lot of questions and answers, even from council at that point, I would guess. Council back to us for sure.
Steve,
Sean, I'm just gonna say, in regards to trying to wrap it up by the September, it seems like when I'm sitting here, I'm listening to all of us, we have a very high consensus on a lot of the items that we'd want to first address, the items that are talking about the nuisances and the enforcement. And so I think, then that's the majority. I don't really think that we need to have more meetings to kind of discuss over and over again those items. Just need to get them listed. They're going to be broad recommendations. It's going to go to the planning commission, and with Ryan, we're going to kind of be taking a look at it, trying to determine, can these be enforced? How do we legally try to write it up so we can present it to the council? Obviously, the task force recommendations are going to be taken very highly in the recommendations, but once we're kind of looking at it from a true zoning or from a true planning, we may have to make, decisions on what really gets presented to council. That won't happen in one meeting within the planning commission either. So the idea would be by the time it gets to planning, we'll probably be in October. We'll have some draft discussions. Task force can continue to supply information to the planning commission, just like we can to the city council by attending the meetings, either online or in person. But I think that we kind of got to the point to where we actually are pretty consistent on what we're looking for. And so I'd like to see us go ahead and have something at the next meeting that we could, kind of all agree that we want to move forward with for that September. That's just my thought, as opposed to really kind of extending it.
Lauren, as a council person, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Steve in the fact that these are broad recommendations. The planning commission, like one of the things that I would like planning commission to look at is narrowing down neighborhoods as far as, if you go by a residential zone, that's pretty broad and that's tough, right? But when you go street by street, this whole street is short-term rentals and there's 2 full-time residents, but then you go to the next street and there's a lot of full-time residents. So it's kind of hard to look at it that way, but maybe that's something that we could task the planning commission to say, hey, let's get this narrowed down a little bit. But that's more of a broad recommendation is, hey, let's look at our residential zoning areas and then go into whether caps are even necessary or what we need to do with that. But not saying, yes, as a task force, we're recommending 30%, cap on this area. I think it's more of a, let's take it to planning so they can review each residential area and decide, what has happened in those specific areas of the city.
Speaking on behalf of planning, I would definitely say I agree. Ryan and myself and the whole planning commission talked about, could we put zoning on our agenda for 2023? And knowing that we had short-term rental and the waterfront, we said we kind of get it, the task force comments and review those and address what we could from the nuisance standpoint of short-term rental, and then try to determine, do we have to kind of look at it from a zoning? And if we were to try to put it in by zones, whether it's an R1 or whether it's specific to a zone, that would require us to kind of go back and really make certain we got the zones right. And I think that's a monumental task. That's probably a 24, type of objective. But I agree with you. That would have to be looked at next if we were trying to talk about anything in regards to the percentages or the numbers.
Yeah, and I agree with Ann. I would like to see all of us start to write down, what that good neighbor policy should include, what sort of enforcement we need to recommend, and whether that is, things that planning commission, not planning, but what Ryan does through his office, you know, what kind of enforcement and what we're asking the sheriff's department to handle as well. I think we need recommendations on those things.
Yeah, I mean, so I think at this point, if we kind of get at the higher level of stuff we want to get done, I think then, you know, the planning commission working with staff and then council working with staff can get into the nitty gritty detail of how we actually accomplish it. And so, again, if we kind of look at the range of options to discuss next week, if we need, I mean, we could always schedule a meeting between the next meeting and it'd be the 14th, September 14th, if we need another meeting. I do think given, I think we need to present at least, you know, I think we need to present something to planning on the 21st, since that was a commitment. And again, Sean, it may well be that we don't think we have enough information to make a recommendation on this, and we recommend that, you know, planning commission or the task force or whomever continue to study it. But I think we do have to present something to honor that commitment. I know we're like at 10 to 5 and we need public comment again. Are there other things we need, anybody else have before we move to public comment? Yeah.
One thing to add. So since I didn't comment earlier,
Sorry.
no, it's fine. Some of seems like a lot of the complaints, as Joe said, is the larger houses. And I think back at that and I think it's the people that are running these short-term rentals as a business and putting lots of beds in them. I think that needs to be looked at. I think that will help take care of parking, trash, noise issues. I think in general, the market's gonna auto-correct a little bit. I don't know if we should be looking at a percentage at this point. I would like to address maybe the other things that I previously mentioned first to see if that takes care of the issues.
Great. All right, anything else before we note the correspondence and go to public comment? Okay. In our packets, we had communications from both Christina Wood and Ron Collins. So thanks to both of them for reaching out to us. Much appreciated. Which brings us to the second public comment. This can be about anything related to short-term rentals. So why don't we start in the room and then we can move to Zoom.
Hi, Mark Wright, 558 Mason and 125 Elizabeth. So I agree. Well, first off, I thank you guys for what you're doing. This is not an easy task. I agree with Sean and Ann both that whatever action's taken, I believe it needs to come slowly. And because you cannot arbitrarily all of a sudden devalue my property by saying you can't have a short-term rental. And so, I mean, if it's a 2-year moratorium, whatever. I also agree. I don't disagree with the cap. I'm not opposed to that. But I think you also need to think about you cannot monetize a certificate of occupancy or a short-term rental certificate because that's what you'll end up doing. I mean, if I have one on this house, I can sell it for more, but my neighbor could possibly sell it for, a value, but he doesn't have that certificate. So, I mean, I think that needs to be taken into account as well, is how do you implement that lottery system? I really don't like investing my money on the roll of the dice, where I don't know what it would be valued at. So that's all I got to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? Yep, come forward.
My name is Gary Kemp, 1022 Holland Street. I like the way this is moving towards really the enforcement and some, not caps, because I don't like caps, but I like the tone of where you guys are going. That's one thing. But number two, I think you could solve this problem for the most part, the 80-20 rule, if you would do two things. One is, if you want to set a cap on occupancy in a home. the problem you're all having, and I've had it in our rentals, is the more people you have, the more families you have, the louder the noise, the bigger the problem. It's real simple. We did this in one of our rentals. We actually made it smaller. We stopped letting people sleep on the couch and the sofa bed and that kind of thing, and went down to 3 beds. It's a 3-bedroom home. We allow 6 people. Our quality of our people has gone up. The problems have gone down. You don't get these big groups. And I think that's really a critical issue. I would suggest you consider 2 beds per bedroom. And I mean, 2 people per bedroom, not 2 beds, 2 people per bedroom. If you get, like some of these places, you can have 2 queen beds and 2 sets of bunk beds. You got a family in 1 bedroom. And that's insane. I mean, you're asking, that's all going to cause problems, especially in residential areas. I realize it hurts the economy of the people who own the home, but I think that would solve a big part of the problem. The other thing that I think would solve a big part of the problem is what you're saying about enforcement. You got to have a good set of rules, and you got to enforce them. And you got to take people's licenses away if they continue to not do what they're supposed to be doing. You have enforcement, you limit the occupancies to a reasonable amount of people. 80% of the problems are going to go away instantly. Caps, I think, are just nothing but a problem. If you try to do a cap on how many homes you can have in an area or a street or whatever, you're going to have nothing but lawsuits. Talk to my attorney about all this, and he says, I hope they do it because it's going to make me a rich man. Okay, so that's really my thought is, do those 2 things and you'll solve your problem.
Thank you. Anyone else in the room? All right, let's move to Zoom. Keith?
Hi, my name's Keith Cherrick. I live on the hill in Saugatuck. And I want to thank you all for doing the volunteerism that you're doing, because you have a tough road. But that being said, I've wrote some stuff down. I'm going to read it. I'm not too worried about a sense of community for the tourists. I believe that will always be there. I've lived in this community for about 30 years, 33 years. And it really hasn't taken hardcore drops in real estate value. In the 2009 crisis, a bunch of people came in and bought a lot of properties that had been foreclosed on. And in the pursuing 2 or 3 years, they jumped up. And the same thing now with no drop during the pandemic, but a lot of people came in and moved into the community. What I don't want to lose is a sense of community, especially for the residents. Somebody brought up earlier that 70% of the residents of the homes in our community are non-homesteaded. That means 23% are only homesteaded. I'm curious about what these percentages were 5 years, 10 years, 20, 25, 30 years ago. From what I can see and tell, homesteaded properties have dropped over the ensuing 25, 30 years, and non-homesteaded has arisen. The residential population, coincidentally, has dropped with that, and dropped dramatically. I believe there's 827 residences now, and I questioned a few of the stats about earlier, but I won't do that now. If left unchecked, this will continue with the drop of available residential housing in Saugatuck. And I've said this before, the available pool of local residents who will be able to volunteer, serve on committees and councils has also dropped during those years, and it also will drop in the future. And if nothing is done in relation to stop the downward trend, it will continue, and our residential community will eventually disappear And we'll just be almost like we're a 70% theoretical tourist community now. And so we do need a cap. And I like the idea of what the lawyers said. Grandfather everybody in, put a lower percentage cap on, and as people stop their short-term rentals, they don't get relicensed. And you'll get more permanent residents. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else on Zoom? Anyone else in the room? All right. Oh, wait. Sorry. I'm sorry, I didn't see you.
Michael Economist. I live at 716 Park Street. This community has really changed in the 20-some years that we've been here. And the direction is not going. I bought a home to live in. I expected to have neighbors. I had neighbors. I don't have neighbors anymore. It takes me, if I want to come into town, go shopping or whatever, I now have at least a half an hour before the time is the time for the event to happen, because I can't find a parking spot. Now, I guess, change is change, but it's not a residential community. The emphasis is on tourism, 100%. And I don't know what you do about it. I can't tell you, but I'm just telling you what I see. I have to drive a half an hour, probably in 3 or 4 years, I'll have to drive an hour before I can find a parking spot. That's not what I bought. But,
Thank you. Okay, last call in the room, Zoom. Okay. I think any final thoughts from anyone? All right. May I have a motion to adjourn?
I will make a motion to adjourn.
Second? All in favor?
Aye.
Thanks.